In the last financial year, Australia imported $308 billion worth of goods from overseas. We exported $395 billion worth, much of that, of course, iron ore, coal and LNG. The goods coming into our country, though, face a problem. Ships with crew carrying COVID are a risk to our nation. Yet, to not have those imports would choke off our economy within months. And as our economy opens up, the ability to manage outbreaks quickly in the supply chain is vital to keep goods moving and also to keep costs down. Joining me now, Ports Australia Chief Executive Mike Gallacher. Mike, thank you so much for your time. There's a few issues here, but of course, trying to make certain that crew arriving on ships with goods, making certain that they're safe, is really important to the whole supply chain.
Absolutely. I've got to say, we've been dealing with the pandemic now for over a year and a half. We've only just recently had one event where a maritime worker, an Australian domestic maritime worker, was infected with COVID. And that person, unfortunately, was caught up in a long-term Torres Strait piloting job, which meant they were with that crew for a period of time. But when you think of the tens of thousands of vessels that have come in and out of Australian ports in that last year and a half, not one. It is a great credit to all the people at the ports, what they've done.
And yet around the world we're hearing of supply chains being affected because crews are effectively caught on ships that they can't get off and have been there for months. So that's the big issue, isn't it, to make certain that those events don't happen here in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. We have done our best to protect that biosecurity ring around the country. And of course, the language of the last couple of days and the last week or so has been a positive one towards a relaxation of the border restrictions towards international visitors coming in and out of the country. And our concern, of course, is that whilst we are doing what we can in our workplace, the moment there's a relaxation in the domestic setting, that could in effect start to also have an impact on our port personnel, not in the work environment, but in the wider community as they're going about their normal lives. We cannot afford to have these people, be they pilots, be they marine surveyors, be they stevedores, be they truck drivers, people working in logistics parks inland. We cannot have them falling prey to this virus without there being planning around it.
Okay, so is there an argument here that really, as an essential industry to keep Australia's economy moving, keep imports coming in, that there should be an argument for mandating vaccinations inside the whole of the supply chain and logistics area?
Look, in our space, talking anecdotally to my members, clearly they can't force their personnel to tell them, but there has been an overwhelming positive response from maritime workers around the country, recognising the need to be vaccinated. And I think eventually, if we can ever get to see what those figures are without it being mandatory, I think it'll be very positive. But of course, there are other people along the supply chain, and it's going to be up to government in policy how they deal with this, but recognising that we understand our role and the criticality of it, and we're prepared to work with governments, state ports, privately owned ports, all of them are prepared to work with government. We need that direction in that regard, what they want us to do.
Because we can see already when the supply chain is disrupted what's happened to Australia Post in the past week or so, where in New South Wales, as a result of outbreaks in its Chullora plant in particular, it wasn't able to take goods from businesses for a matter of 3 days in the past week. Now, this is only a small example of what could happen if there are outbreaks inside the whole of that supply chain.
Look, we laugh at it now, but we shouldn't. But we laugh at it now. A year and a half ago, all of the debate about toilet paper. But of course, it was symptomatic of the panic and the lack of concern and lack of understanding in the community in relation to the supply chain. And we can all remember the Prime Minister's frustration, pleading with the Australian people, whilst we, the supply chain, the trucking industry, the stevedores, the ports, everyone involved, we were trying to assure the public, we've got your back, we've got this covered. The panic was on, but there was no real need for it to be there. But you can only imagine if there's no planning, particularly with health orders, once they start to come in play following a relaxation of our borders, and if the governments, and I'm talking numerous governments, are talking about they're expecting significant spread of COVID once there is a relaxation, you can only begin to imagine what that panic will be like if the supply chain is broken, because we actually haven't worked with government to do the planning. Or should I say, we're prepared and willing. We need the government and the health officials to come to us and start talking to us what they're expecting the new norm to look like, what are they proposing in terms of restrictions, and then we can do the modelling to work out, okay, if 10%, 15% of our workforce get infected, what does that mean in terms of our overall workforce capability to actually be able to keep the supply chain working? They need to talk to us, but they need to take us into their confidence.
Okay, so what about your members, the Ports of Australia, and what they're doing right now to keep their staff safe in terms of vaccinations, in terms of rapid antigen testing? What are they doing right now?
Look, it starts with the pilots, and they are absolutely critical as the first line of defence, if you like, of that biosecurity ring, because our marine pilots go on to every vessel that comes into this country and brings them to harbour safely. They've all got local expertise. You can't just move them around willy-nilly. These people are experts in their field, in the ports and the harbours that they work. They go on board these vessels, they get off the vessel, they go straight home. They stay at home. They don't mix with their fellow workmates. They're given a job. They then head back down to the port. They get onto a vessel. They stay away from the crew, go out, bring the ship, the freight vessel into harbour, go back home again. We've got all of these plans in place where we're separating our crews just in case one of our crews come down. And this is just not pilots. This is people, operational people working right across our ports, be they engineers, work health and safety personnel. We've divided the workplaces up and we've kept them separated. So at least if one crew or one shift goes down, we can keep the place operating. But that's in this current environment. We're clearly heading towards an environment where the government is expecting widespread vaccination to be the last line of defence in terms of widespread infection by COVID. Therefore, our people are at risk like everybody else, be they police, ambulance, you name it. But we need to be assured that the government understands the criticality of the supply chain to ensure that we know what their plans are going to be so we can start planning for it. If we don't, and they just announce, like the countdown towards New Year's Eve, 78%, 79, 80%, let's open the doors. If that happens, we simply won't be able to plan for it, and we just won't have the contingency in place to protect the supply chain.
Okay, and the risk here is if the goods can't come through to Australia for whatever reason, and we're already hearing about the increasing costs of the supply chain, bringing, in particular, containers into Australia, the cost of freight is rising. But if all of a sudden a whole lot of goods can't arrive in Australia, be they computers or microchips or whatever it is, cars, the price here inexorably has to rise, doesn't it?
Not only will it rise, but the question will be, will it be able to get in? Or what will be the criticality in terms of it getting through in a reasonable time frame? We have Christmas, and of course, the nation is looking to this Christmas to be a bit of a relief, to bring families back together, and everyone's starting to focus in on this. And of course, we too recognise the need to help all of those struggling businesses, be they small, medium or large, that have all been caught up, as we all have, in the restrictions of COVID. They are all relying, be it the barista who wants his coffee beans coming in from Colombia, or indeed the retailer who's looking for TVs, phones and everything else and everything in between. If we can't get them through because the supply chain's broken, that will have a deleterious effect in the morale of the nation. Because right now we need a lift. The government's talking about this in a positive way. We want to be part of that positive lift, and the last thing we want to see is a kick in the guts at the last hour where we cannot get material through to people, much needed materials, be they retailers, be they shopkeepers. We can't get it through because the supply chain was overlooked in the planning.
Mike Gallacher, Chief Executive of Ports Australia, I appreciate your time on the program today.
Thank you, Ross.